Agotavach, this is Gemar Nedarim Daf Samoch Zayin, another exciting day in the world of Daf Yomi as we once again begin another incredible parak, a quite famous parak, if I must add, parak Naira Hameurasa, as we will begin momentarily. And again, today's shir, as all the shirim for the month of Teves, has been generously sponsored by a close friend of the Daf as a Schos Ili Neshama, for Aryalei ben Rav Yaakov v'Siyata Dishmaya. The learning of the entire Chabura should bring Rav Aryalei ben Rav Yaakov to an higher place in Gan Eden Shalmaila, closer to the Kisei HaKavod, and ultimately be a Melitz Yesher for his entire family. As well as you can see on your screen, we're finishing up a fundraiser for my new shul. Anyone that would like to contribute, I personally thank everyone that already has contributed. It's a tremendous mitzvah, building a shul in a community that doesn't really have one. As the Shulchan Aruch teaches, Binyan Beis HaKnesses is Adif Mikulam. So holding on the bottom of Samuch Vav Amid Beis, says the Mishnah, Naira HaMeurasa, which is of course the name of the parak. Naira, who's a young girl, HaMeurasa, that did Eirisin. So each detail of this Mishnah is important. Naira is a girl between the age of 12 and 12 and a half. Hameurasa is that she did Eirisin. As we already know, we've learned extensively there's two stages to marriage. You have Eirisin and you have Nisuin. So we're discussing that only the Eirisin has been done. And of course, after Eirisin, the girl remains in her father's Rishos until Nisuin. So it's not quote-unquote engagement like we call it nowadays, but it's at some level such. What is the halacha of such a girl? Avia ubayla mefir nidara. Her father and her husband, her arus, can be mefir her nidarim, can annul her vows. And this line really is going to be the focus of the entire shir of today. The entire shir of today is going to focus on this detail, which is Naira Hamurasa Avia ubayla Meifirin Nita Reho. And we continue in the Mishnah, one more second, we're having a minor issue over here. Okay, that's sort of what we wanted, but not for right now. Okay, we'll get there towards the end of the year. Apologies, that's just going to be, we're going to be using Daf HaChaim today to help us get the drushes that we'll get to in a moment. So again, Naira Murasa, apologies. Avio Baila Mefir Nidara, her father and husband can be made for Nidar. Hafir Ha'av V'loy Hafir Habal. The Mishnah continues that if the father was made for another vow, not the husband, or Hafir Habal V'lo Hafir Ha'av, Einai Mufar does not work. Vein Tzarech Leimer, and certainly Sheikayim Echad Mehem. So there's really one din, as we just pointed out, in the entirety of the Mishnah. And this din is what? That a Naira Hamurasa, who is the one that could annul her vows? Both her father and her husband, her arus, as we mentioned. And then the Mishnah continues with almost a partially repetitive din, that if one of them did mefer the neder, was annul the vow, either the father or the husband, it does not work. And certainly, if one of them was mekayim the vow as well, it does not work. So we begin the Gemara. The Gemara says, Hainu Reisha, as we pointed out at the end of the Mishnah, is quite a bit repetitive. Avio baila mefir nidarel. It says the husband and father are made for it. So certainly, if one does, it does not work. Answers the Gemara, as is often the case, whenever we have a avia ubayla, we often have this question: is the vav achibur? Is it an or is it an and? Says the Gemara, what is it over here? What we see over here, says the Gemara, the hava mina was that it was an or. Kamash malan the Mishnah, by the end of the Mishnah, to teach us that it is an and. Kamash Malan, the Mishnah. And now we continue to the last line of the Mishnah. And certainly if one of them was Mekayim, then it does not work. Asks the Gemara, Lamli Lamisni, why do we have to say this final clause in the Mishnah? Hashta yesh leimar hafar zebelai now that you taught me that if one of them is mefer without the other, What's the halacha? It does not work. Kayim echad mehem lamali. Why do we need to know if one of them is mekayim? That's obvious. Lamali lemisti, lamali srich lemisti, different gear size. Answers. Okay, we're getting a little choppy over here. Let's hope that this choppiness, let's try to close this down. Here we go. Says the Gemara, so why do we need to repeat this case? Answers the Gemara, ki itzrich lei. You know what the necessity in the Mishnah of saying the final lie ve'in tzarich lemer shekayim echad mehem is ki goyin dehafar echad mehem v'kayim echad. If one was mefer, one was mekayim. So what's mekayim? We know that if a woman makes a neder or a child makes a neder, a child doesn't have a power to make a neder. But if they do, the halacha is, then the halacha is that the father or the husband have the chance to be mekayim, to say it is a good neder. So now the question is, what if we have this unique split? We have a father and a husband being an aris. So what if one of them is mekayim and one of them is mefer? Now what happens? V'chazar ha-mekayim. And the one that was fulfilled the vow, v'nishal al hakamasai, he asked, he undid his hakama, his certification of the vow or confirmation of the vow. So now what's the halacha? Again, father and husband. Let's say husband said, Hefer, I want to get rid of this vow. Father said, Mekayim, I want to certify this vow. What happens next? Father wants to certify the vow. Father goes, oh, you know what? I don't want to do that. He goes to a Talmid Chacham. He removes his akama. So now one would have thought, what are we left with? We're left with two people saying they don't want this vow, both the husband and the father. So ma'u the tema, the havamina is my doiki ha'akira, that which he was a mekim, he now is a mefer. So if he's now mefer, now you have two people being mefer to the neder, both the father and the husband, so it should work. Kamash malot, no. Timafirim shneim bivas achas. That it only works if we are mefer, if both of them are mefer bevas achas, and if one of them is mefer, like in this case, and then the next one comes along after being shayel on doing his hakama, that does not work. So now it is a little bit interesting, as many people are probably wondering, how we just spoke about the second half of the Mishnah, and now we're going to go back to din number 1 in the Mishnah and speak about the first din of the Mishnah. It is a little bit interesting, but that is what the Gemara does. So now we go back, and for the duration of today's shir, and this is going to take us all the way into tomorrow as well, says the Gemara, V'naira hamurasa avia ubayla mefir nedara. Let's go into the root din. This din, a girl who's 12 years old, a girl who did Eris. And now let's just point out one more detail. A girl who's 12 years old is not a ketana, but she's not a gedola, a boigaris. A boigaris is when she hits the age of 12 and a half. 12 and a half, she's in her own rishos. At 12, she's a naira. She's a quasi. She's floating in between. She's not a kitana, but she's not a boigaris of 12 and a half. So she's quasi. She's somewhat in her father's rishos. Similarly, an arus is what? Somewhat in her husband's rishos, somewhat in her father's rishos. So we have this girl who's sort of floating between two worlds. What did the Mishnah teach us? The Mishnah taught us Avia ubayla. Both of them together are mefer the neder. So ask the Gemara, we're about 10 lines at the bottom of Samach Zayin and Halif, Minolan, where do we know this din from? Amar Rabba says, Rabba, Amar Kra, the Torah teaches us, V'im, a very important vav, V'im, adding on Haisa le'ish, and if there was a neder v'nadra aleha, and her vows are upon her. Mikan, from here we learn out, L'naira hamurasa shavilu b'ayla mefir nidra. Now the question is, how in the world for this pasuk do we learn this out? So for a moment, we scroll all the way down to the Ran. The Ran over here, 6 lines at the end of the Amid, explains. Let's read a few lines of this Ran. Again, if anyone gets a little bit confused, just the way we're going to do this is we're going to read the Gemara. The Gemara is going to have a few stages, and then afterwards, utilizing the wonderful notes of dafachayim.org, we're going to play it out with all the psukim. Says the Ran, again, we're in the 4th wide line of the Ran, the last round on this Amid. Nearly, Dachi Kamar. There's another pasuk, and that's really the critical ingredient we have to remember. There's only going to be 3 psukim in total. So there's a pasuk about Nisua, a girl who's fully married. Tahainu, and base Isha Nadara. That's the pasuk about a Nisua. Kidavarsh like Kaman, as we're going to say. Al Karchin, by force, what do we have to say? Hai Ba'arusa Misukma. That this pasuk that the Gemara just quoted, this pasuk of Imai Siya Ish Nadara Aleh, must be talking about an Arus. Why? Why would we need 2 times the Torah to teach me that if you have a Nesua, that she can have her Nedarim being Mefer? But since it's talking about an Arus, Al Karchan, again by force we have to say, it's the Divav, that first Vav of Ve'im Ish is Maisiv Al Inyan Rishon. It's coming to add on to the original topic, Dil El Mineh of the Pasuk, Siv Hashem Yitzlach La. The previous Pasuk, Hashem Yitzlach La, Hashem will forgive. Ki Hein Ya Avia Isa. And then the pasuk says, "In b'yayim shamai isha yani isa." Loimar. So what does this pasuk teach us? She'avia u'bayla puts the 2 together. Are mefirin nidarel. Vasi shabir ba'arusa. And it makes a lot of sense that it's talking about arusa. The kivan the ba'arusa, since it's an arus as we explained. Lo yatzasa mer shosav. An arus is not fully out of the father's rishos. So it makes a lot of sense that the arus, the husband, cannot be made for by himself, and it makes a lot of sense it's in conjunction with the father. So says the Ran, since the first pasuk number 1 is talking about Nisua, this pasuk is coming to add on to the Nisua. Then not only could the husband annul the vow, but his father as well. Going back to the Gemara. Asks the Gemara, 1 second. Maybe it is talking about Nesua. So what's the obvious question? The Ran already Kita said what's bothering us. 4 lines at the bottom says the Gemara, Nesua, what do you mean? We know that is a different pasuk that already spoke about Nesua, which is then makes Isha Nadara, that if one's wife, if she made a neder in her husband's house, that her husband could get rid of the neder. So already have a pasuk about Nesua. So why would we need a second pasuk teaching me that a Nesua, the husband, could get rid of her nedarim? Answers the Gemara, Ema tarvai b'Nesua. No, maybe they really are both by Nesua. If they're both by Nesua, we're up the creek. Again, we're looking for a source that a naira hamu rasa, both the father and husband together annul her vow. Says the Gemara, no. Maybe it's talking about Nesua. If it's a Nesua, we already have a pasuk. Maybe they're both by Nesua. Why would we need 2 by Nesua? For what reason? Says the Gemara, you know why? We need 2 psukim. One pasuk to teach me that the husband can, yes, get rid of his wife's vows of his real wife Nesuin, that they're fully married. And the second pasuk would add on that he could only get rid of her current vows, but not her earlier vows. She'eina ba'al mefer b'koymin, that he cannot get rid of vows that she made before they were married. So now we flip over to Samach Zayin Amid Beis, in which the Gemara asks, 1 second, you just suggested that we need 2 psukim talking about a Nesua. 1 to teach me that the husband can yes annul her vows, and 2 to teach me that he only could be made for a vow that she made under his jurisdiction, but not a neder that she made before they were married. Says the Gemara, 1 second. Once you have this second pasuk, once you have the pasuk that teaches me that the husband cannot be made for a vow that made before they were married, so what's the obvious implication? If he can't be made for earlier Nedarim, what can he yes do? He of course can yes be made for current Nedarim. So why will we need 2 psukim? So now we have source number 1 from Naira Murasa is Avia Avel Baila Mefir Nidarel is what? The first pasuk that we quoted, Vim Haya Siya Leish Unadara Alel. That this is pasuk number 2 in the Torah, adds on to pasuk number 1, Pasuk number 1 teaches us the Nisua. Pasuk number 2 teaches us this Arusa. V'im adds on to the first pasuk his husband. Here it's also the father. Why? Because clearly this pasuk does not talk about Nisua, because we already have the first pasuk. And to have two pasukim about Nisua, we clearly do not need. Because if it would be teaching me the Chiddush that a Nisua could only be made for current Nedarim and not preconceived, not earlier Nedarim, we would not need that, because then implicitly we would know if you could not undo earlier Nedarim, you could undo current Nedarim. Ibayis Ema says the Gemara, a second source. Again, we have one verified source that Nedarim Ras Avio Bailam Efir Nedara. Says the Gemara, Ibayis Ema, I'll give you a second source that what? That second pasuk refers to an aris. The Havaya Kedushin Mashma, because the pasuk used the word of Havaya. As let's just go back for a moment. What was the pasuk? Vim Hayusiya. That word of Havaya is a word that connotes Erusin. That's how we know the pasuk is talking about Erusin. Asks the Gemara. Okay, so now you have two reasons to assume that this second pasuk is talking about Erusin. But ask the Gemara, Ema av l'chudei mefer, how do you know? V'im is going back to modify the first pasuk to teach me that this Nair Amuras can be undone both by the father and the husband in conjunction together. Wait, maybe it's only the father. Answers the Gemara 3 lines down, Im Kain, if that was true, that it's only the father of Asra, Isra, Beis, Avia, Yania, Isa, Lama, Li. Why would we need the next pasuk? The next pasuk that clearly says the father can get rid of the vow. That pasuk of Asra, Isra is the source that every father can annul the vows of his kitana, of his daughter who's a minor. Says the Gemara, 1 second. If you would now be learning a source that a father could get rid of the vow of even his Naira HaMe'urasa, even this girl that had Erusin, certainly if there was no Erusin, he could get rid of the vow. So why would we need a special pasuk of Asr Isser? Must be that since we have a pasuk Asr Isser, our pasuk doesn't mean father by itself, it means father in conjunction with the husband. Ask the Gemara 1 step further, Ema Avli by Aris. 1 second, let's split a hair. Maybe when the father gets rid of the vow, Li by Aris, he needs the Aris with him to help the husband. But the Aris l'chudei mefer. But maybe the Aris by itself could yes be mefer. And if you're going to ask me, why would we need a pasuk by the father that he can annul his daughter's vows when she's a ketana lamali? You know what we need it for? For as follows. Lamali. You know what we need it for? We needed to teach us that if he was making the neder, that's the chiddush. You just asked me, why would we need another pasuk? If he could undo the neder of his daughter who's an arusa, certainly he can undo the neder of his daughter who is not an arusa. Says the Gemara, no. Maybe there is an extra chiddush if he was making the neder. Answers the Gemara, Im Kain Beis Isha Nadra Lamai. Kasav, why would the pasuk have to say the pasuk of Beis Isha Nadra? Kal v'chaymer Umah b'makamav Aris Mever l'chudei. If there is a father, still the Aris can undo it himself. Shloima kamav mi bai. Says the Gemara, wait. Ema in Beis Isha Nadra Loimar Sheina Bal Mever b'kaydmin. Uminei Aris Mever b'kaydmin. So says the Gemara, you know why? It must be because of the partnership of the father. That's the reason why. And therefore, says the Gemara, Rabbah's source does not work. So now, in order to get this clear, let's pull up the wonderful notes of, 1 second. Here we go. The wonderful notes of Daf HaChaim. Here we go. Absolutely stunning notes of Daf HaChaim. And through these notes, what we're going to do is we're going to chazer the Amud that we just learned, and as well, hopefully, gain an added level of clarity to what we just learned. So let's go back over here. Again, these notes are public on dafachayim.org. Absolutely fascinating notes. Let's just learn them together, which will be a quick chazara for 2 minutes as we finish the shiur and give us an added clarity before we call it a day. Here we go. First, we quote the Mishnah. Does not work, and one of them is mekayim. Says the Gemara, what's the chiddush? The chiddush is kigoin the hafer echem v'kayim echem. That was the chiddush, and then he goes back and he's shayil. That's the chiddush of the Mishnah. Okay, that was part number 1 of today's share. Part number 2 is what is the source of Nair Marasa Avia Va'avros Mekimin Umefirim B'Shotfis, that they both could do it. So Rabbah says, that's the pasuk that we're discussing. So over here, beautifully, we have painted out for us, which is what the Ran goes through, the psukim. Number 1, this is the father. This is a naira that's not married, as you see over here. That what's the halacha naira that's not married? The father on his own is mefer. Then we have pasuk number 2, is the pasuk that Rabbah quotes in Ma'aseh Ish, which is a naira that is yes married, they can both do it together. And then we have pasuk number 3, which is talking about a nisua. So again, pasuk number 1, single girl. Pasuk number 2, arusa. Pasuk number 3, nisua. We're talking about pasuk number 2, which Rabbah says is the source for a naira hamura, so both father and husband are mefirin the neder. So says the Gemara, how do we know that the second pasuk, the second set of psukim, is referring to our Mishnah? So in order to get there, we have to break down the din in our Mishnah. That our Mishnah about Naira Hamurasa, that the father and the aris is the one that we're talking about, and that they are Mekimim Umefirin Nidareha. So says the Gemara, and this is the Iba Yisim of our Gemara, that im hayusiya, that Havaya, the words hayusiya talks about arusin, erusin, and therefore we know that the pasuk is not talking about nisuin. Number 1. Number 2, which was the first teretz, I read this backwards, that is another pasuk in base isha. So 2 reasons why the pasuk is not talking about a nisua, but rather about an arusa. Okay, so now we know the pasuk is talking about an arusa, and now we want to know, how do we know that both the father and the arus are the ones being mefer? Says the Gemara, it can't be that we're talking about the aris by himself. Why not? Firstly, we're going to read this right to left. Firstly, because why would we need the pasuk by Nesua? If you could do it in the case of Erisin, certainly you could do it in the case of Nesuin. And secondly, once we know the halacha, the Baal cannot be made for Bekaimin, and the Aris could yes be made for Nekaimin, therefore that's why we need the pasuk. And therefore we conclude that Mekim Refir Nedarim is Shotfis. So again, don't tell me that the father and the Aris are Mekim is Shotfis, but the father himself could yes. Why? Because we have the other pasuk. Don't tell me it's about the father Ba'akama b'Shos ba'Aris l'Chudei Mefer. Why? Because Kardan Nisua Lamali, and that's really where we end. And over here it just brings down the Vei Rabbi Yishmael, which is going to be tomorrow's daf. So we come out that we have these 3 psukim. The first pasuk is talking about the father getting rid of her Nedarim when she is not married. The second pasuk is referred to when she's in Arusa. The third pasuk is when she's in Esua. The first pasuk is teaching me the father by himself is mefer in the case of when she's not married. The second pasuk, the third pasuk is teaching me that in Esua, that even on Esua, I should say, cannot undo kaidmin, previous made vows. And the second pasuk is in Arusa, and the only way that we can explain this is if we assume that Arusa's husband, the only way that he could be getting rid of the Nedarim is together with the father. We'll pick it up from Tanat V'Yishmael in the next year, B'siyata Dishmaya.